The beaches of Florida have always been a symbol of freedom. Golden sand stretching endlessly into warm, turquoise water, families laughing under the summer sun, and tourists arriving by the millions every single year. But on a seemingly ordinary morning, something changed. Officials arrived at several of Florida's most visited coastal stretches and began doing something nobody expected, shutting them down. No warning, no public explanation at first. Just barriers, hazard tape, and officials in protective gear moving urgently along the shoreline. Within hours, the closure spread. Within days, the story broke across national news channels. Something had been discovered beneath Florida's coastal waters, something that changed how scientists, government agencies, and ordinary residents thought about the ocean beneath their feet. This is not a story about pollution or algae blooms. This is something far stranger, far more complex, and far more alarming than anything Florida's coastlines have faced before. What officials discovered in the deep water, just beyond those famous beaches, set off a chain of emergency responses, scientific investigations, and urgent policy decisions that are still unfolding today. The sequence of events began when a routine coastal monitoring team deployed underwater drones as part of a standard oceanographic survey off Florida's southern coast. These surveys happen regularly, designed to track sediment movement, coral health, water chemistry, and shifting underwater topography. On most days, the data comes back predictable, unremarkable, and quickly filed away. This time was different. The drone footage, transmitted back in real time to researchers aboard the survey vessel, showed something that immediately stopped the team in their tracks. Massive depressions had formed on the seafloor in areas that had previously been mapped as geologically stable. These were not minor shifts. Some of these newly detected cavities stretched hundreds of feet across and plunged to extraordinary depths, with edges that appeared to be actively collapsing inward as the cameras rolled. The scientists on board recognized immediately that they were looking at something significant and potentially dangerous. The formations were identified as underwater sinkholes, sometimes referred to in scientific literature as blue hole sinkholes. But what distinguished these from previously known formations was their apparent instability. Older blue holes, like the famous Great Blue Hole off the coast of Belize, are ancient, stable structures that have long since finished their geological evolution. These formations near Florida were different. Sonar imaging showed turbulent sediment plumes swirling inside the depressions, and the surrounding edges continued to crumble during observation. Water chemistry readings collected inside and around the formations revealed sharp changes in salinity, oxygen concentration, and mineral composition, all of which pointed to highly active underground processes driving the formations from below. What alarmed researchers even more was the suggestion, emerging from drone footage and sonar data, that these sinkholes were not isolated events scattered randomly across the seafloor. Instead, the data hinted at a connected network, a system of underground channels linking multiple collapse points beneath the ocean in a pattern that implied something much larger was happening beneath the seabed. Marine geologists began to raise serious questions about whether a widespread geological destabilization was occurring, hidden from view beneath hundreds of feet of ocean water, slowly pulling apart the foundations beneath Florida's coastal zone. When the findings were reported to coastal management authorities and relevant federal agencies, the decision to close affected beaches was made quickly. Officials cited precautionary concerns about unpredictable water movement, potential hazards to swimmers and divers, and the need to establish safety perimeters while the situation was assessed. Temporary closures were announced along sections of coastline in proximity to the most active formations, with officials monitoring offshore zones and deploying additional equipment to track changes in real time. The public response was immediate: confusion, concern, and a flood of questions that officials were not yet fully equipped to answer. To understand why these discoveries triggered such an urgent response, it helps to understand what underwater sinkholes actually are and why they form. Florida sits atop one of the most extensive karst limestone systems in the world. Karst landscapes form when soluble rock, primarily limestone, is gradually dissolved by slightly acidic groundwater moving through the ground over thousands or millions of years. This process hollows out the rock from within, creating a vast, invisible network of caves, tunnels, and chambers beneath the surface. On land, Florida's famous spring systems are the visible expression of this underground world. But the same geology extends far offshore, beneath the ocean floor, where ancient limestone formations continue to exist in various stages of dissolution. For much of recorded geological history, these offshore limestone systems remained stable because the conditions surrounding them changed slowly. But researchers now believe that several converging forces are accelerating the destabilization of these ancient underground structures. Rising sea levels alter the pressure exerted on seafloor sediments and the submerged limestone beneath them. Changes in ocean temperature affect the chemical reactions driving limestone dissolution. Shifting groundwater dynamics beneath the seabed move through cave systems in new patterns, eroding support structures from within. When enough internal support is removed, the ceiling of an underground cavity collapses, and a sinkhole is born. On land, sinkholes are a known hazard in Florida, regularly swallowing sections of road, front lawns, and occasionally entire structures. Underwater, the same process occurs, but with additional complications. The immense pressure of overlying water can amplify the force of a collapse. The sudden displacement of sediment and water creates powerful currents that ripple outward from the formation point. And because the ocean environment conceals these processes from ordinary observation, the formations can grow to extraordinary sizes before they are detected at all. Scientists studying the newly identified formations have proposed multiple explanations for why they appear to be forming now with greater frequency. One theory centers on ancient freshwater aquifers buried beneath the seabed, which may be responding to pressure changes caused by rising sea levels. As the weight and chemistry of overlying seawater changes, these aquifer systems can shift in ways that promote collapse. Another theory focuses on methane gas, a subject that emerged repeatedly during the early investigation of the offshore anomalies. Deep underground, ancient organic material produces methane gas, which can accumulate beneath sediment layers. When methane accumulates in sufficient quantities, it can weaken the structural integrity of the surrounding sediment from below, creating unstable voids that eventually give way. Researchers have noted that some of the most active sinkhole formations appear to be associated with areas where methane readings in the surrounding water are elevated, suggesting a direct relationship between the two phenomena. The connection between the sinkhole formations and methane activity beneath Florida's offshore waters became one of the most significant threads of the ongoing investigation. During survey expeditions conducted east of the Florida Panhandle, researchers identified more than 50 active methane seep sites, releasing continuous streams of gas upward from the ocean floor. The scale of what they documented was unexpected. Some of the methane plumes extended nearly 800 feet upward through the water column, forming towering columns of rising gas bubbles that moved silently through the dark ocean depths before dissolving into the surrounding water. Beneath the ocean floor, much of the methane that exists is stored in a stable, frozen form known as methane hydrate, an ice-like substance that forms when methane molecules become trapped under conditions of high pressure and low temperature. These hydrate deposits can persist in a stable state for thousands of years, locked within sediment layers and posing no immediate threat to the geological structures above them. But as ocean temperatures rise and conditions at the seafloor change, the stability of methane hydrate deposits becomes vulnerable. Warming water temperatures, combined with shifting ocean currents and subtle tectonic stresses in the seafloor, are believed to be gradually destabilizing frozen methane reservoirs that were previously locked away. When methane hydrate breaks down and the gas inside escapes, it rises through whatever pathways it can find: cracks in the sediment, voids left by dissolving limestone, or weak points in the geological layers above. As gas moves upward, it leaves behind spaces inside the sediment from which it was released. Those spaces do not simply remain empty. Over time, overlying layers sink into them. The surrounding sediment loses cohesion, and the entire structure becomes progressively less stable. Researchers have described this process as a contributing mechanism to both sinkhole formation and a broader pattern of seafloor weakening, a slow but potentially significant erosion of the structural integrity of the ocean bottom beneath Florida's coastal zone. Beyond the geological implications, the release of methane into the water column also carries environmental consequences. Methane is among the most potent greenhouse gases in Earth's atmosphere, trapping heat far more effectively than carbon dioxide over shorter timescales. While much of the methane released from seafloor seeps dissolves into the ocean water before reaching the surface, large or sustained releases can alter water chemistry in measurable ways, reducing dissolved oxygen levels, shifting the acid balance of the water, and affecting the survival of marine organisms sensitive to these changes. Scientists monitoring Florida's offshore waters have expressed concern that sustained methane seep activity could affect not only the geological stability of the seafloor, but also the health of the coral reef systems, fish populations, and marine food chains that depend on stable ocean chemistry. Among the most visually striking and ecologically alarming discoveries associated with the overall situation off Florida's coast was the dramatic change in the condition of the state's coral reef systems. Florida is home to the only living barrier reef in the continental United States, stretching along its southern tip through the Florida Keys and representing one of the most biologically diverse marine ecosystems in the Western Hemisphere. In recent months, large sections of this reef have displayed a phenomenon that marine biologists describe with a combination of scientific precision and genuine alarm: fluorescent bleaching. Under ordinary circumstances, coral bleaching occurs when water temperatures rise beyond the thermal tolerance of the coral organisms. Heat stress causes coral to expel the symbiotic algae, called zooxanthellae, that live within their tissues and provide both their distinctive color and the primary source of their nutrition. Without these algae, the coral turns white and begins to starve. If temperatures return to normal quickly, coral can recover. If the stress persists, the coral dies. Fluorescent bleaching adds another dimension to this already serious process. When coral is under severe thermal stress, some species release fluorescent proteins as a kind of last-ditch biological response, a chemical shield that may offer some protection against light damage while the coral is in its most vulnerable state. The result is a haunting, ghostly glow across sections of reef that might appear beautiful from a distance but represents, in biological terms, an organism in crisis. Satellite imaging of the reef areas near the Florida Keys showed that the zones exhibiting fluorescent bleaching had expanded significantly within a relatively short period. Local fish populations and invertebrate communities in the affected zones have declined measurably, and certain sections of reef have been designated ecological disaster zones by monitoring agencies. The loss carries enormous practical consequences beyond the ecological. Florida's reef system generates billions of dollars annually in tourism revenue, fishing activity, and diving-related commerce. The reef also functions as a natural barrier, absorbing wave energy from storms and reducing the severity of flooding during hurricane events. As the reef degrades, that protective function weakens, and Florida's coastline, already vulnerable to storm surge and sea level rise, becomes even more exposed. Parallel to the investigation of sinkholes, methane seeps, and reef degradation, a separate set of measurements collected through satellite altimetry, seafloor pressure sensors, and advanced sonar mapping had been quietly documenting something deeply unsettling about the behavior of Florida's continental shelf. The continental shelf is the submerged extension of the continent, a vast, gently sloping platform of rock, sediment, and marine habitat that stretches outward from the shoreline before dropping away into the deep ocean. For most of recorded history, Florida's continental shelf has been treated as a relatively stable geological feature. New data is now challenging that assumption in significant ways. Scientists studying the Miami Terrace and Florida escarpment regions have detected gradual downward movement in sections of the shelf, shifts occurring at only a few centimeters per year, but consistent enough to register across multiple measurement systems and raise red flags among geologists familiar with the consequences of seafloor instability. At the rates observed, the movement itself may not pose an immediate threat, but researchers warn that gradual shifting of this kind can be a precursor to more sudden, dramatic events. When sediment layers weaken progressively and the structural support beneath them erodes, whether through methane seepage, limestone dissolution, underground fluid movement, or some combination of all three, the cumulative effect can eventually produce rapid collapse rather than continued gradual movement. The risk that most concerned scientists in this context is the possibility of a submarine landslide, an event in which a large section of the seafloor suddenly breaks loose and slides downslope, displacing an enormous volume of water in the process. Computer simulations based on the geology of Florida's offshore slopes suggest that a significant submarine landslide in this region could generate tsunami-like waves of meaningful height capable of reaching nearby coastlines in a very short time. Because much of Florida's population lives at or near sea level, even relatively modest wave events could cause serious flooding, infrastructure damage, and dangerous conditions for coastal residents. Unlike hurricanes, which approach over the course of days and allow time for preparation and evacuation, waves generated by an underwater landslide would arrive with dramatically less warning, potentially minutes rather than hours, as if the combination of collapsing sinkholes, methane seeps, degrading reefs, and shifting geology were not enough to demand urgent scientific and governmental attention. Researchers conducting deep-sea expeditions near Florida's Atlantic waters encountered yet another phenomenon that added another layer of alarm to an already complex situation: expanding underwater brine pools forming along sections of the ocean floor. These brine pools, sometimes called underwater lakes or, in starker terms, death lakes, are bodies of water so dense with dissolved salt and toxic gases that they settle into depressions on the seafloor and remain there, nearly motionless, separated from the surrounding ocean like a contained body of poison sitting within the sea. The water inside these pools is saturated with hydrogen sulfide and methane gas, and the concentration of salt makes it far heavier than regular seawater, preventing it from mixing with the ocean above. The chemical environment inside the pools contains virtually no dissolved oxygen, making them immediately lethal to nearly any marine organism that enters. Footage captured by remotely operated underwater vehicles during the expedition documented the deadly effectiveness of these pools with disturbing clarity. Fish and crustaceans that ventured into the brine lost mobility almost instantly and drifted lifeless into the depths of the pools within moments of contact. The edges of the formations were littered with the remains of organisms that had inadvertently crossed into the toxic zone. Researchers explained that hydrogen sulfide interferes directly with cellular respiration, essentially causing animals to suffocate despite being surrounded by water. What elevated the concern surrounding these discoveries from scientific curiosity to genuine alarm was evidence that the brine pools are not static. Rather than remaining as isolated pockets on the seafloor, many of the pools appear to be growing, expanding outward and, in some cases, merging with neighboring formations to create larger interconnected systems of toxic water that stretch across significant sections of the seafloor. As they expand, they eliminate the habitats that once existed in their place. Coral communities, shellfish beds, microorganism populations, and the countless small organisms that form the foundation of the marine food chain. Scientists suspect that underground salt deposits, dissolving and migrating upward through fractures in the sedimentary layers, are feeding the pools from below, while hidden channels may be allowing them to spread farther and faster than surface conditions alone would suggest. The cumulative weight of these discoveries, underwater sinkholes forming in geologically active patterns, methane seeps releasing gas from dozens of active sites, coral reefs flashing fluorescent distress signals across vast areas, the continental shelf showing signs of gradual movement, and toxic brine pools expanding across the ocean floor, produced a response from government agencies and research institutions that was notable for both its scope and its urgency. Beach closures were the most visible public action, representing the precautionary judgment of officials who understood that conditions offshore were too uncertain and potentially too dangerous to allow normal recreational activity to continue without interruption. But behind the beach barriers, a much larger mobilization was underway. Federal agencies coordinated with university research teams and private oceanographic organizations to deploy expanded networks of monitoring equipment across the affected offshore zones. Deep-sea sensors designed to track pressure changes, sediment movement, temperature gradients, and gas activity were placed at multiple locations on and near the seafloor. Remotely operated vehicles continued their survey work, collecting sediment samples, recording high-definition video of active formation zones, and measuring the chemical properties of the surrounding water in detail. Researchers working with the data emphasized repeatedly that while the situation was serious and warranted close monitoring, many fundamental questions remained unanswered, including what exactly was driving the apparent acceleration of these geological and chemical processes, and how closely the different phenomena were connected to one another. What scientists did agree on was that the picture emerging from Florida's offshore waters was far more complex and dynamic than the prevailing scientific understanding had accounted for. The seafloor, once treated as a relatively passive backdrop to the more visible marine environment above it, was revealing itself to be an active, shifting, chemically complex system, one capable of producing rapid and significant changes with consequences that extend far above the waterline. The interaction between rising ocean temperatures, ancient geological structures, stored gas deposits, and shifting sediment layers appeared to be producing effects that no single factor could fully explain on its own. For Florida's coastal communities, the developments carried implications that reached well beyond the immediate inconvenience of closed beaches. The state's economy, its infrastructure, its storm resilience, and the livelihoods of millions of people who depend on a healthy coastal environment are all directly tied to the stability and health of the ocean systems just offshore. What is happening beneath Florida's waves is not a distant scientific abstraction. It is a set of processes unfolding within miles of populated shorelines, reshaping the geological and ecological foundations on which Florida's entire coastal way of life rests. The discoveries made in recent months have forced a fundamental reassessment of how much was understood about the ocean floor in this region, and how much still remains hidden, shifting, and waiting to be found. The beaches may reopen. The sonar buoys will keep listening. The drones will keep descending into the dark blue holes, and the ocean, as it always has, will keep its secrets until the pressure becomes too great to hold them any longer.